Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the 15th Annual Povich Symposium. My name is Caitlin Wilson, and I am the Assistant Director of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism at Merrill College. Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that we will be recording this panel and it will be shared on our Merrill College YouTube channel tomorrow. Following our initial discussion, we will open things up for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function. It is Povich Center policy to reserve the first two questions for students. I've been a part of the Povich Symposium for many years, dating back to when I attended them as a student, but this is my very first virtual event. And while we are all thankful technology allows us to gather and discuss this important topic during these difficult times, I know we all look forward to the day we can gather again in person. But until then, we will Zoom away. And now I'd like to turn things over to new Povich Center Director, Mark Hyman.
Thanks, Caitlin, and welcome to the 15th Annual Povich Symposium at Merrill College of Journalism. Our topic tonight, diversity in the owner's box, how sports will be different when women and people of color are represented equitably. We have a wonderful panel tonight, and I want to thank each member, Kim, Len, Kevin, Doug, and Maury, for allowing us to listen in on what will be a great conversation. I also want to thank the Miami Marlins, who last week made history and gave us even more to talk about tonight by hiring Kim Eng as general manager. Kim Eng, the first woman and the first woman of color to be a general manager in any major professional sports league. Well done, Marlins. Now I'd like to introduce the Dean of Merrill College of Journalism, Lucy Delglich.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at Philip Merrill College of Journalism, welcome to the annual Shirley Povich Symposium. Many things have changed since we gathered last year. Thanks to many of you who made contributions, especially the Povich family and Don Graham, we have created the George Solomon Chair in Sports Journalism. And we're pleased that Mark Hyman will be filling the big shoes of the remarkable George Solomon as the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism Director. The other big change is obvious. We're not meeting in person this year, but thanks to the wonder of technology, the Povich Center has not missed a beat, and we're together tonight for another exciting evening. The Povich Center continues to be a leader in the national conversation on sports, culture, race, gender, politics, and ethics. Tonight's panel discussion is a great demonstration of that leadership. Merrill College is also a leader in preparing tomorrow's sports journalists, and you're going to meet one of them in just a moment. In the spring, we are adding courses in sports analytics and the business of college sports. We hope to be able to offer more of our courses to non-journalism majors at the University of Maryland in years to come. Thank you to Kim, Doug, Kevin, and Len for joining us tonight, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this important topic. And as always, thank you, Maury, for leading the discussion. Mark, back to you.
Thanks, Lucy. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ryan McFadden, a fine student in the master's degree program at Merrill College. And Ryan will have the honor of introducing the panel. Ryan?
Good evening, everyone. And I would like to introduce tonight's panel for this virtual event, starting off with Len Elmore, who is a former All-American basketball player at the University of Maryland, who went on to play 10 seasons in the NBA. Len is the first NBA player to graduate from Harvard Law School and is now a senior lecturer at Columbia University. Kim Pegula is the president of the Buffalo Bills and Buffalo Sabres. She is the first woman president of a NFL and NHL franchise. Doug Glanville is a senior center fielder and the first African-American Ivy Leaguer to play in the MLB. Doug has contributed to the New York Times as well as the Athletic. Kevin Blackistone is a professor for the practice at the Povich Center, and he is also a sports columnist for the Washington Post and a panelist for ESPN's Around the Horn. And lastly, I would like to introduce the moderator for tonight's symposium, television personality, and the son of Shirley Povich, Maury Povich.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thanks, Ryan. I have a couple of things to say about our panel. I mean, I'm old enough to have covered Len Elmore when he was at the University of Maryland and played for Lefty Driesell. And I know how good he was. And I'm so happy he's here now, especially since he was the first NBA player ever, and maybe the only one to graduate Harvard Law School. Doug Glanville, I want to thank you very much for going to the University of Pennsylvania, because you majored in systems engineering and I majored in just trying to get out of there. And I want to thank you very much. Kim, you have a wonder book story. No one could possibly do what you have done. This is a woman who was a toddler, found on a street corner next to the police station in Seoul, South Korea, adopted by a Canadian family, moving to New York State when she was a child. And now she and her husband, Terry, sold their oil and gas business for billions. And, you know, it's one thing to be an owner of a franchise. It's another thing to be the president, which she is, the president and co-owner, not only of the Buffalo Bills, but of the Buffalo Sabres in the National Hockey League. And everybody, you know, in terms of Kevin, everybody who ever was at the University of Maryland in the last 15 years knows Kevin as one of the most popular professors there. And he's been a very, very important member of the Povich Center since its founding. I'm thankful for all of you for being here. And let's start with what Mark talked about. There were two very recent moves. And I want to know from our guests whether this has moved the needle at all. Kim Ang, she has been in baseball for 30 years. She has worked at the New York Yankees. She's worked at the Los Angeles Dodgers. She's worked at Major League Baseball. And on 10 occasions, she interviewed to be a general manager. And she came away with nothing. And then finally, on the 11th try, she is now the general manager of the Miami Marlins. And then in the NFL this past week or so, the NFL owners decided that for any assistant coach on their team, if that coach gets hired as a head coach elsewhere, they get draft choices. And if anyone in their executive management area gets hired as a general manager, they get draft choices. So let's start with these two sports. First of all, in football, Kim, does this move the needle, what the NFL did, or not?
No, certainly all these things, and there's been others as we've expanded the Rudy Rule, as most people know it as, to move the needle. I know that there has been, conversations that if you look at and just counting the numbers of Black head coaches, that you would think that maybe we haven't moved any needles, but I don't think that that is the end result, and that does not show all the work that we're doing behind the scenes. And I am on that committee that did present that resolution to the ownership group that got passed. And our thought behind that was that, listen, we want to not just, we want to encourage the development of our diverse coaches and our diverse GMs. And when a team brings somebody into the fold, especially in a lower position, they put the time and the effort into it. And then as we want to really make sure that the opportunities are equal for all coaches to be open up, and having someone that you've developed the time and the effort into, and then having them become a head coach, it's great, it's wonderful for them. But as you know, it's sometimes all about winning, and that upsets your whole balance of your coaching staff and your team. So we want to make sure that we promoted that we promoted the development, and that it wasn't a detriment to your team.
Let me just be a bit of a cynic here. Would some people think of this as a bribe? Could you call it a bribe? I mean, you're trying to.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
well, first of all, it is a third round compensatory pick. Okay, so it is not, it doesn't quite hold the same value. Certainly, yes, it is. They are draft picks. The person has to be employed in your organization for at least 2 full seasons in order to qualify, and those picks don't come until 1 pick a year for the next 2 years in the upcoming draft. So
Great.
it is not.
Yeah, I got it.
It was not. It was no.
You know, it's the journalist in me. What can I
Yes,
do?
well, your wife said there's a lot of stirring you like to do. So,
Right,
but no,
okay.
we did consider that as a bribe, and we just felt like, listen, we need to do what is right, and teams do spend effort and time, and we want to bring in. What we didn't want is we didn't want people to say, well, if we're going to lose our guys to another team consistently, you know, well, we're just not going to bring anybody in. And that's the opposite of what we want to do. And we think there is a very important part of that process of the development stage. So we wanted to make sure that that was helped balance out that and not be considered a bribe, as you called it.
By the way, I want to encourage our other panelists on a particular topic just to jump in if you have something to say about that. Let me move to the baseball angle with Kim Ang. Doug, does it mean anything?
Well, it does. It means a lot. And I think it means something when you talk about representation, you know, just the starting point of having representation, you know, whether it's a ceiling she's cracking. She's also put in so much time. She's probably the most qualified GM in history. I mean, she's touched every stone along the way. And the thing I think there's a difference with respect to the Selig rule, which governs that baseball has to interview minority candidates, not just at the top levels, but also throughout the organizational structures in Major League Baseball. Then you talk about a pipeline. You're trying to build something that has some undergirding that's stronger than just say, okay, we just hired this one person. They did have a good vision about having a flow through where the system is built on diversity throughout. And that's encouraging, even as it's slow to change, more so probably than baseball than other sports. But I do think they thought that one through to try to create that infrastructure. So she is highly respected, tremendous talent, and perseverance is, you know, off the charts. And I'm sure she'll do great work. And that's going to just open up doors as people can see themselves, and other women can come and say, wait a minute, this is possible. There's just been this breakthrough.
Let me see this. Excuse. What? Let me ask you this, Len. The NBA has been considered by most people the most progressive.
See, I thought I was having trouble with my high speed.
I think you lost Maury there.
Maury gone? Yeah.
He'll be back.
I'm going to step into the moderator's role here while we're waiting for Maury. So Len.
Hey, Mark, if we could, can I weigh in real quick on the
absolutely.
NFL question? Yeah. I mean, I think what Kim spoke of, promoting and development is really important. And the third round picks, you know, they could be prime motivators, because when you take a look, historically, there have been some pretty good guys picked in the third round. You know, Russell Wilson, Travis Kelce, Alvin Kamara, Jason Witten, and a whole lot of others. So, you know, it's not as though you're you know, being given the door prize or something along those lines. And some of those guys will last longer than the coaches. So I think it will have a motivating factor for the development and promotion of folks of color, particularly Black coaches. And as far as Kim is concerned, you know, the axiom, you can't be it if you can't see it, I think that's now been torn down. It's interesting, though, to see if she'll be given the same runway that white males are often given to prove her skills, and that Blacks and other folks of color and women are often shortchanged with. So, you know, that'll determine if this is gimmick or legitimate. But I trust Derek Jeter and their ownership. They're doing it because of her experience and their abilities. So, you know, that's kind of my take on those two.
And interesting that, of course, Kim Eng was hired essentially by the CEO of the Marlins, Derek Jeter, another front office person of color.
Right.
I wonder if you could reflect on that. Maybe Doug or Kevin, can you talk about that? What is the significance of Derek Jeter making this hire? What does it tell us about the importance of minorities, of people of color in the front office in a position to hire others?
Well, it suggests to me that it's unfortunate it would take the one person of color in that position to hire someone of color in the position that Kim Eng has been hired. And as Doug pointed out, I mean, she's been up for just about every decent job opening in Major League Baseball, and for whatever reasons, wasn't able to get it. So for me, does any of this move the needle? It really doesn't, because all of this is happening not out of the altruism on the part of the people who are doing the hiring, or necessarily because they are weighing these candidates just like they do all the other candidates, but it's because pressure is being brought upon them to make this happen. Let's not forget, these events that we're talking about have happened in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the racial reckoning that has gone on in this country, which has touched every industry possible. Native folk have been fighting for eons to have the Washington football team change its name. Yet it wasn't until this racial reckoning since the spring that it actually happened. And so now you've seen these other doors open. You see not only sports, but corporate America in all corners trying to make some amends for their inequitable treatment of people of color for decades. And so that's the way I look at it. I will say that the needle has been moved when people of color are being given the exact same opportunities without the need for a bayonet being pointed at those who wind up hiring.
But you got to start someplace.
Yeah.
And just real quick, you have to start someplace. And again, I teach a sports management course. And when I said you can't be it if you can't see it, suddenly the women in a class now who really never thought about careers in baseball per se are now going, okay. And you need to get that cohort to come and kick the glass ceiling apart.
Well, that's true.
Before, I don't think there were a lot of women.
Well, that's true.
Moving the needle in my regard.
I thought coming into this, I was just thinking about this discussion tonight, and the first sports column I ever wrote was in October of 1990. And that sports column was on a lawsuit filed by Doug Moe Jr., who at the time was an assistant coach for the Denver Nuggets. And he filed a discrimination lawsuit. You remember who he filed that discrimination lawsuit against? It was Bertram Lee and Peter Bino, who had just become the first owners of any major sports team in America. They had purchased 37.5%, I think is what it worked out to, of the Denver Nuggets. And they fired Doug Moe Jr. He was an assistant, and he claimed in his lawsuit, which I said at the time was frivolous, and I'm not a lawyer like you're a lawyer, but he claimed that it was reverse discrimination. And so we've had these moments, right? But still here we are in 2020 talking about the fact that we have not solved these issues and that women and people of color are not being treated equitably within sports when it comes to hiring.
Mr. Povich is back. So that means that I'm going to go away for a while.
We got to unmute you, Mr. Povich. There we go.
You're still muted, Maury.
Okay, this gives me a chance to ask one more before I go away. This is a question for everyone on the panel, and I think it really goes to the central theme of what we're talking about tonight. we understand the fairness and equity arguments in favor of greater diversity in ownership. We understand that. What's the business argument for people of color and women being represented in ownership in a more substantial way?
Well, let's let our owner talk about that. Kim?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you know, most sports teams, we have a fan base, locally as well as across the nation. And I think you can make the business case that, if your organization is representing the people that you're serving, which, are our fans and our society, that there is better engagement, at least in terms of the sports. I know that we have done a lot of work in our marketing area about how do we engage in a more direct way, and how do we kind of look at our fan base with the needs of that particular fan. So we talk about the 360-degree view of our fans, and so and we can't get those insights and learnings and understanding if our organization is not being represented. So what might work for one group of folks, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's age, may not work for somebody else. But we don't have those insights if our organization as a business is not being represented, and we don't have other people like weighing in on what those different genders or race or color or however our fans are represented, and what best works for them, and how do we keep them engaged, because it's not a one size fits all anymore. And when it comes to sports and engaging with our fans, so I mean, that's in a nutshell for me, that's what, on a business sense, why I would like, more diversity in our organizations, at our clubs and teams.
It's very interesting. Here are the cold, hard facts when it comes to ownership. There are 2,100 billionaires, and there are 13 African-American billionaires. And one of those African-American billionaires is Michael Jordan, and he is the only majority African-American owner of a major sports franchise. What does that say, Doug? What does that say?
Well, I mean, you talk about the challenge of just getting into that leadership chair and what it's actually taken. One thing to consider, even just in any leadership role, is the power matters. And when the rules of the game continually shift to maintain a certain privilege and advantage, it's very hard to win at that game. For example, take Major League Baseball. Go back to Al Campanis, right? 1987, gets in trouble for talking 40 years after Robinson breaks in, to responding to the question of why there's not any managers, Black managers, coaches, which was really one of Jackie Robinson's dying wish. And he talks about the pipeline, outside of some offensive comments, the pipeline leading up to. But when that pipeline starts to fill up with diversity, it changes, the rules change. And so we see now, for example, a lot of the analytics that's come back in a certain way that algorithms are driving a lot of. So you start to lose the excuse of why you don't have diversity. Because you say, wait a minute, it's sort of like if you're going to do a sci-fi movie that takes place in the year 3587, why does every cast member have to be white, right? Why can't you have diversity? And so some of it is your imagination, but part of it is, that opportunity flows through some of these constructs, these limitations that you have to really break down. And so Jordan getting in that position certainly is one example, but then you have to fill it up with more than just the leadership. So that you actually have qualitative effect, not just sort of a quantity. And that has been a huge challenge.
Do you think, Lenny, that the NBA is different than the other leagues because 80%, 83% of the players in the National Basketball Association are African American, or people of color? People of color, actually.
Yeah, I mean, to the greatest extent, of course they are. And simply because of the labor force that has a tremendous amount of leverage. You could say to a certain extent football could be, but there's more traditional ownership. We're hopeful that, less traditional ownership, more progressive ownership starts to take over in the NFL, like Kim and and others. But yeah, there's no question that the NBA is different. It's a heck of a lot different than when I played. I mean, when I played in the 70s and the early 80s,
Tell me about
racial
tell
and
me about
economic.
tell me about that, because people ought to understand what it was like when you were playing in the mid 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, look, racial and economic times were in flux. I mean, it was just a few years after 1968, which was the last moment by comparison to 2020, the last moment when the nation faced a crossroads regarding race and using sport to amplify injustice. The 70s was a period where society began to experiment. You had affirmative action began to take place. That muted a lot of protests in exchange for a wait and see approach. And the economics, with great inflation, athletes were being paid a bit more, and we could take advantage of the problems of recession, oil prices, gas shortages, high interest rates, rising unemployment. No one dared to complain about equality and risk their jobs because they didn't want to go back out there among other folks who were being oppressed by the economics. But enough was in motion to allow people to speak of progress by comparison to what just had occurred prior to 1968. But it was easy to be blackballed as players. And players certainly aren't. And it wasn't in your face as an athlete. There's no social media, no phone cameras to bring about visceral realism. In light of the not too distant time of sacrifices by Ali and Smith and Carlos, as long as a player could take care of their families and themselves, athletes just simply silently fumed over social justice inequities and took it upon themselves in many ways to personally be part of the solution, as opposed to speaking out and being, visible social activists.
So when it comes to baseball, Doug, when it comes to baseball, it's very interesting. The population when it comes to players in baseball has dwindled when it comes to African Americans and dramatically increased when it's come to Latinos. I mean, what does that mean? Are we going to see more Latino owners, more Latino general managers in baseball before we see African Americans?
Well, you certainly have the numbers based on your sort of playing representation that there should be managers. I mean, I wouldn't see why a requirement to be a manager, you should be bilingual, for example. This is a huge part of the sport. And you're talking about international players, not just, talking about languages, different cultural differences just coming from all over the world. So, baseball certainly has to recognize that. And, I always talk about, we spend a lot of time in baseball talking about those numbers, right? 8%. And what does that mean? Well, you have to also look at that qualitative aspect of it. Are you empowered at 8%? Or do you have a voice? Are you able to challenge issues? Do you have ownership that's reflective and actually will take a stand and engage and leverage their influence with governors and so on to make changes? Or are you just sort of a scattershot of 8%? I think historically it's been, at least sort of recent history, going back even a few years, it's been kind of scattershot, my playing days, for example. And you're waiting for that moment to coalesce in a way that actually represents power, to be able to make change and to, recognize that the fear that's always over your shoulder of if I say anything, you are really that fungible asset, right? You're going to be out the door, especially if you're Black. And so, somehow combining those elements and giving a sustainability to that 8%. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Latino players that are highly influential and highly talented in terms of the top echelon of players, then all of a sudden you could have representation. I think that would be more effective all the way up to the top. And that to me will make a difference for sure.
Let me just ask this question, and you know better than anybody. Is there a resentment when there are more Latinos in Major League Baseball than African Americans? Amongst
African American players?
Yes.
Well, I think there's definitely, I go back to 91 when I was drafted, and there's a time where your head's down, you're just trying to get to the next level. And then when you kind of get there, you start to have a little more awareness about first of all, the dwindling percentage of players that of diversity when you were coming up to what happens at the major league level. And that 8% becomes really clear. And so there is a certain competition. I think there's also a sense of players of color that have a different experience, right? There, you have to recognize that the Black American experience is different than even if you're of color, but you're also from another country. And sort of the challenge of coming together around issues where you're kind of connecting the dots with something different, right? Having a different experience. I thought that's what was so powerful with someone like Yu Darvish, for example, a pitcher from Japan, Iranian heritage, that's wearing his Black Lives Matter shirt and sort of engaging on the subject. That's the opportunity of baseball, because you don't have this sort of community of masses where everybody has this identity connection. You have players from all over. And I think the validation that can come potentially of players from all walks of life in different countries still identifying that Black Lives Matter can send a different type of message that baseball can, I think, capitalize on a good way to say that we're all looking at all of us centered around humanity. And, it's tough for baseball because of that history and the slowness to change. But that would be the optimism of how these players, as you mentioned, can work together to really say, we're going to put humanity at the center of this, recognizing that some of these issues are very specific to race in America.
So, Kim, am I wrong to assess this year as kind of a watershed year when it comes to ownership in the NFL because of this year of protest, what went on, and the reaction of so many players?
Right. No, certainly this was a dynamic year. Listen, a few years ago when it was Colin Kaepernick and the league and the clubs kind of didn't want to get embroiled in a what they, I think a lot of us considered more of a like football is just for games. And this is talking about another issue that we shouldn't be involved in. I think there's been a lot of learning since then. And I know Kevin had brought up kind of just whether or not is this really real, and is it in response to the killing of George Floyd and all the other social unrest that has happened since then. And yes, I'm not going to lie, of course, it has. It's brought about an awareness. It's brought about challenge clubs in our league to be better, to bring about more equity. And, although, should we have done it sooner? Of course we should have. And I think a lot of times, sometimes complacency is not our friend. But I do think that we are now have made a full commitment to listen to our players, to allow our players to use football as a platform for whatever voice that they're using, and not letting the league or the club get in the way. So I definitely do think that this year was definitely a watershed moment. It needed to happen. And, like I said, the truth will be in how long does this last?
So do you see it even in some of those owners who were initially resistant to this?
You know what? I have not seen it from like an owner to owner level. I do think when there's been initiatives at our owners meetings brought up related to, everything from the beginning of the season, we had special programming. We've got End Racism on our fields throughout the whole season at every club. So they were, there was no owner there that, thought that they were not appropriate things to do as a league. And I think every club in every different market every market is different, has certainly done a lot of things I've seen just from club to club that have really reflected on social justice and their initiatives. Some of these things have been done though before George Floyd. Some of the programs that we had at the league level and at a club level have been done before that, but certainly this year has been a moment that is brought about much more real awareness.
Let me ask you this, Kevin. There's one big part of this that we haven't mentioned, and it's the commissioners of all these leagues. Do you think they can make a difference, or are they just spokespeople for the owners?
Well, I think both. I think on one hand, clearly they are, commissioners are employees of the owners. That's who, Roger Goodell gets a $44 million check or whatever it is, that comes from the owners. right? But they also are in positions of power where they can make a difference. I remember when the Michael Sam story developed, and Roger Goodell made it a point to say that he hoped that Michael Sam, the first openly gay professional football player, hopeful, would get an opportunity to play in the league with any club. But with Colin Kaepernick, he did not make that same pledge. And you can see how the rest of the league reacted. They took
but you must admit that Roger, Roger admitted his mistake.
Well, sure, he admitted his mistake, but by the time he admitted his mistake,
Kaepernick
was under two bridges down the road.
Of course, and Kaepernick's been out of football, and he's been denied a job. I mean, There's no question about that.
Right, but he stood up for the opportunity for Michael Sam to gain employment, and maybe that was a judgment on his part, or maybe the owner's part, on who was most valuable and who was most dangerous to the league in terms of its fans and its corporate sponsors. So the answer to the question is, if you're a commissioner, yes, you can provide guidance, you can provide some leadership, but yes, you are also working at the behest of the men and women who employ you.
Mark, are we at the time for questions, or can we continue here? I didn't hear Mark. Mark, are you there? Well, maybe we'll move on.
You've got 5 more minutes, Maury.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Kim, you have other women who are owners of NFL teams.
Yep.
But are you alone when you're a president? Are you alone in that capacity?
I've told myself, I've told many people that, when I first became owner, you enjoyed all the perks of being ownership of a team. And then when I became president, I actually had to do all the work now. And so my husband still gets to be kind of all the perks of ownership, but now I'm doing all the work. So yes, I forgot what your question was, Maury.
The question was, are you alone? I mean,
am I alone?
You're a person of color, and you are a woman, and you're the president of an NFL franchise.
I'm trying to think. There is a lot of women owners, and there are a lot of actually women that are very involved in the club themselves. There are daughters, a lot of daughters, nieces, family-related relations. I'm trying to think. As president, I believe I am the only female president. Right?
I think you are too. But I must say, for instance, I looked at a statistic when it came, for instance, for the NFL office. I mean, there are 28% people of color in the NFL office. There are actually only 6.3% of general managers. That's no change in the last 17 years. I mean, general managers, to me, I mean, that is, in the NFL, that's a very big job, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And we had one. We had a Black general manager. But I will tell you just honestly from our own, it had nothing to do with race at the time. It was that, we felt like he wasn't the right person for the job, and the results that showed both, on the field and off the field. And that was the decision, that we made. I will tell you, as an ownership group, and listen, our clubs and our leagues, we do unconscious bias training, right? And so that is just one area that I just think we all could really get better at. And I myself am not, knowledgeable in that space at all. I'm trying to learn and be better in that. But as an owner, when you're making these hires for especially the head coach and the GM, we are looking for the right person that's for that team. I know personally, Terry and I, we're not looking at the race part of it, and should we increase our diversity numbers? Should we be, it is truly ownership. You spend all the money and the time and the effort. You want to win, and you're looking at things from a hiring perspective. So I do think there's value in having a wider, a diverse candidate pool that you can certainly do, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and someone else can come in that you didn't maybe think of before and changes your mind. I do, and I think that's why there hasn't been as much acceleration of diverse coaches and GMs in football. I think that there are so many different factors that every club looks at, and I don't know that we have enough. I know we have people in the pipeline. It has to be some kind of unconscious bias. I just don't see ownership purposely leaving out our Black, coaches and GMs.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to bring up, there's a great assistant coach now for the Kansas City Chiefs named Eric Bieniemy. I don't know how many times he has interviewed for a head coaching job. He hasn't been able to get one yet. I don't know what to think when somebody interviews so many times and that they're so gifted at what they do. Why they don't get a job? I don't get that.
I didn't interview Eric, so I don't know. I can give you an example. And like I said, I don't know what the thought process is of the people, but we've got two coordinators, one Leslie Frazier, our defensive coordinator, Brian Dable, our offensive coordinator.
By the way, a former head coach, Leslie Frazier.
Yes, we had a great defense last year, or the last 2 years, and Leslie did not get an interview for a head coach position, but Brian Dable did in our offense, which was not quite as good as our defense. I don't know what ownerships are looking for their particular team, but there's an example where and I had the conversation with Leslie, saying like, Kim, I didn't even get I didn't get an interview, and how does that make me feel? Like, I feel like there is something there that a sense of discrimination when I see other people getting at least an interview, and I haven't gotten any recognition at all. And we made a few changes from an ownership level. And I talked to Leslie about that. One of the things he says, like, we don't get, Black candidates don't always get engagement with ownership, with other ownerships, just that total level. So unfortunately, we didn't have our league annual meeting this year, where we typically just bring our head coach and our GM. But I told Leslie, like, listen, if you want more access to ownerships around the league, we'll bring you to our annual meeting where every owner will be represented, and you will have you can.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, because if you're looking to be a head coach and a GM is there, and you got to interview with the GM, it would be nice to know if the owner has some kind of input on a personal level with you.
Well, sure. It's a lot easier when you know a little bit about somebody. There's just, right off the start, you have at least that connection. That's what Leslie was sharing with me. And that's just part of it. It's just, if sitting down and listening and seeing where the struggles and the roadblocks are and how you can help in those ways. I can't guarantee him a job, but I can make the path there a little bit easier for him.
Well, when it comes to head coaching, that can be all the way through all the major sports, not just football.
So we have an audience that is really eager to get some questions to this group. So Maury, with your permission,
go right ahead.
Take over. Not eager to do that, but before we go to questions, I think Len had a point that he wanted to contribute to that last question.
Okay. Good.
Well, actually, overall, because we're talking about ownership again, and particularly when it comes to Black owners. Maury, you mentioned 13 Black billionaires. And when you take a look in the NFL, it's mostly individual and family ownership. And so this is a question of Black family wealth accumulation, which is not going to happen overnight. So, in trying to get more Black owners, maybe the paradigm has to change. When you take a look at the NBA toyed with changing the terminology of ownership, simply because of the implication when you got owners and almost every owner is white. There's an implication there. Maybe the paradigm of ownership should change. Should we start allowing public ownership where, somebody who is not necessarily a billionaire, but somebody with means can take the lead? I mean, there's got to be some changes because Black family wealth accumulation is not going to occur overnight. And, we've got hedge fund owners, we've got other folks who have sold businesses that, most Black folks in America don't have access to. So, I mean, if we're looking to really improve Black ownership, some of that certainly we have today, and maybe there needs to be changes on that front.
It's a really interesting point.
If I could just add to that, I mean, that's really the crux of this situation. It's systemic, and that's what Len's getting at. And I'll just point to an example. If you look at the WNBA, most of the WNBA teams are owned by white men. Okay, the Atlanta Dream owned by a couple of women, one of whom is extremely problematic to women, particularly women of color. But the Seattle Storm happened to be owned by an organization of women, an LLC. And so maybe if we are going to be serious about providing diversity or opening the door to diverse ownership in these other major sports, and the NFL is not easy. I mean, this is the biggest, richest, most powerful sports corporation on the planet Earth at $19 billion a year. If you are serious about it, then you do have to explore, as Len was saying, these other means of allowing for ownership, LLCs like the Seattle Storm.
Okay.
Here's kind of a very broad question, but I think an important one. Of course, the title of this panel is How Sports Will Change When Women and People of Color Are More Prominent in Ownership. And there's an assumption built into the title of the panel that sports would change in a profound way if women and people of color were represented more equitably. Do you believe that? And if so, how do you think professional sports would change? Let's start with Len Elmore.
Yeah, I believe it will change because of experiences and sensitivities and recognition. I mean, we just talked about a pipeline and the fact that so many owners don't have access to meeting people that they can identify with, whether it's implicit bias or unconscious bias or whatever. So I think just on that front alone, that there are going to be changes. And it doesn't mean that, the new experiences, say I have or Kevin has had or anybody else. But I mean, there's an assumption there that there is an empathy. And I think that's where it begins. And you can appeal to the empathy. If they don't have it outright, it can be appealed to because somewhere down the line, there is a shared experience there. So, and the person certainly has to want to make a difference or the LLC or whomever the new paradigm is. They're going to want to make a difference, knowing that, they are there and there's a purpose for them to be there other than just running the team. That's my opinion.
Kim, if more women were running NFL teams, would the NFL be different in any qualitative way?
Boy, that's a loaded question. There's actually quite a few women that are very engaged and own the team. So myself, Dee Haslam with Cleveland, Gail Benson with New Orleans, Sheila Hamp with Detroit. And then there's a lot of other owners that are, have been wives that aren't actively participating in the engagement of their team, but there has been a lot of women, and then there's a lot of other, because the NFL is very family oriented. There's a lot of these clubs that have been around in the family for generations, and however that family dynamic happens, sometimes then it's you have daughters now, right, instead of sons, and so sometimes that, like I said, I do believe that can happen, increase ownership of women and diverse people of color, because it's happening already now. It's not we're not at zero, and I think that's in football, at least it's a family dynamic that helps push that along. But how would it look differently? I think I'd like to think, because hey, listen, not every, female is the same either, right? So it's not just as black and white as male versus female. So I do think that there's probably, if more women were owners and active and part of the league, I would say there was probably just more problem solving, I think, maybe happening, more negotiating. If they're anything like me, if it's one end of the scale or the other, like I always think that there's some place in the middle we could all meet on. I'd like to think that that's the way it would be, but we women have issues too.
Absolutely. Doug, what do you think? Would Major League Baseball be any different if 6 teams were owned by people of color?
I believe it would. And I also, double down on the point that it has to be more than just the top. I think you need to kind of think about, it's sort of like in baseball, you think of coming up through Little League. Baseball is very much into developmental, the way you kind of come up through the ranks, right? In Little League, you work through college or whatever it may be, and then the minor league system. If you have a systematic approach, to address some of these challenges along systemic racism and all, then you can protect against it more. If that one person at the top, that sort of shining star, doesn't make it, you don't feel like all hope is lost. Because I think what sometimes is underestimated is that bias is such a tremendous driver, and there's so many times that people say, well, I'm a good person and therefore it just works out. You really have to design for bias. You have to design for it. You have to, it's think about like the blind auditions, right? In the orchestra, in the music industry, where in the 70s, it was 4% of the musicians were women. And then they put the curtain down and said, okay, I'm gonna have you blind so that when you listen, you're listening with more than just your eyes. And all of a sudden that shot up to nearly 40%. Well, everybody before that thought, hey, I'm not biased, but it's there. And you have to be intentional about it to recognize that you have these problems, because often it's not recognized that everybody feels that their best intention is enough, and it's not. So being deliberate in these systems matters. And I think in baseball, if you have a structure that's not just only at the ownership level, which I think matters, of course, for power, you also need to have representation throughout, because you're coming up in the minor leagues, you're meeting people from all different levels, your hitting coach and your trainer. And I mean, it's affecting you on all different levels. And the more representation there that actually has power, the more difference you can make.
Kevin, you want to crack at this or not?
We can move on, Matt. I think the 2 words that jumped out to me, or phrases, design and empathy. And when you're talking about a systemic problem, you have to change the system. It doesn't matter whether or not you change the people. You change the people and you hope, as Len said, that they would be more empathetic to folks like themselves. But it's still the system. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Buffalo suffered was one of the cities this summer that suffered a fatal police shooting. And I think the police captain was Black, I believe, and had to resign, I think, if memory serves. So it's not just the people, but it's the system that has to be changed. It's not as simple as putting in a woman and giving her some power, putting in a Black man and giving him some power and expecting things to change. This is an ownership situation. So you still have ownership versus labor. And is that necessarily going to change the relationship between ownership and labor? Are the 70, 80% Black players in the NFL going to get a better deal on their CBA simply because you have more Black ownership, or are those Black owners going to act like the owners who were there before and try and squeeze as much juice out of them as the previous owners? I don't think that changes.
Okay, here's a question from someone in the audience that's directed at all the panelists, but I think in particular it's for Kim. Can you and the others speak to the presence and use of cheerleaders by NFL teams and whether that makes it more difficult for women to walk into the sport in professional roles? And I just want to add that there are 6 NFL teams that do not have cheerleaders, and the Buffalo Bills are one of those 6 teams. But
Yeah.
Kim?
I'm probably not the best person to ask. I'm still in a lawsuit with the previous cheerleaders, even before we bought the team. But if even if that wasn't the case, I would opt to choose not to have cheerleaders. We have a drum corps instead to do kind of help with the cheering section. But it's hard for me to say from what another owner's viewpoint would be. That's just my viewpoint. I wouldn't have cheerleaders. But I do know that in some, not all, but in some clubs that's they could view that as part of the tradition of their sport or of the club. Whether the most famous cheerleaders, of course, the Dallas Cowboys. I don't know that. And who runs them is Charlotte Jones. Like she's, that's her area. So I do think that, if you're choosing to have cheerleaders and you feel like that's the symbol that you don't want represented in your organization of what, maybe the way of people or think of cheerleaders, then as an owner group, I think that choice is up to you. But I think also too, if you do have cheerleaders and that's part of your history and part of your club, what you're doing with them and how you're showcasing them. And I think that is also a different message.
Anyone else want to address the issue of whether it's time to retire cheerleaders from professional sports?
I don't know which club, but I do think there is one or two or more clubs also that have male cheerleaders.
Good point.
Well, as you know, baseball, I don't think they've had cheerleader, maybe historically. So, except when I played in Puerto Rico, there was a dance team, but very different than I've ever seen.
Why don't you move on? Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead, Martin. Go ahead.
I think probably this is going to be our last question, and it's directed at Len, but for everyone on the panel. During the protests in Kenosha in August, the Milwaukee Bucks players chose not to play a playoff game against the Orlando Magic, which was, as we know, an unprecedented event. And the Bucks ownership, including Mark Lasry, who was born in Morocco, issued a statement that was just a full-throated support of what the players had done. And the question is this an example of people of color and ownership making a difference?
Wow. Well, I'm going to be candid. I wouldn't say that Mark Lasry is someone of color. I know his ethnicity is Middle Eastern, Moroccan, and he's Jewish, I believe. But, I don't think that's material essentially to this whole question of the empathy. I mean, he made a prudent statement, recognizing the leverage that players have to say anything other than that. He would have probably ignited a tinderbox. Now, I know Mark Lasry is a Democratic Party donor, which I approve, and I certainly assume he was a Biden supporter. And I'm sure that he meant what he said. In fact, my kids went to similar schools, and they even played basketball with and against his sons. So, knowing that family a little bit. But as a majority partner of an NBA team where most of the players are of African descent, to say anything different would have been problematic. It's simply shining a light on the issue, a significantly positive impact, economic impact on the city or region. You ought to produce some mechanisms for change. Now, I'm sure Mark Lasry and the Bucks, they employ lobbyists to cultivate power and negotiating leverage in the city of Milwaukee and even in the state that cultivation could be aimed at affecting change, along with negotiating tax breaks and civic concessions for its team in their arena, efforts to influence elimination of qualified immunity for police officers or state criminal justice reform, a great opportunity for wealth building in the Milwaukee area. Those are actions. And I think you got to back up those statements with actions. Because remember, they had a player of their own that was involved in a police brutality situation. And that player ultimately got a money settlement.
Let me,
And I don't know the political and racial, but I doubt if, that feeling is one that he could identify with. So,
Len,
I think that the words are good.
let me ask you this, Len. Do you think that Adam Silver is proactive enough in this area?
I think as proactive as his owners allow him to be. And
So you don't
paradox,
think you don't think he's out there on his own. You don't.
No.
So in other words, he's not leading the owners into a different view.
I think that he has had influence on their view. Remember the paradox. We just saw an article where NBA owners, while they support Black Lives Matter with the statements and the jerseys and all that other stuff, they're still donating to those who support their economic interests, which were a lot of Republicans, which is the antithesis of what this argument is. So I don't know if the league is as profoundly progressive in that regard, but they seem to be saying the right things. And what I'm saying is, okay, back it up with real action.
Right. Okay, Mark.
Well, sadly, it's 8:01. So I think we've come to the end of the evening. On behalf of the Povich Center, I want to thank our panelists so much for spending this time with us. And Maury, thank you for everything you do, including what you did tonight.
Well, I just want to thank our panelists. I think they're great. I thank Kevin. I thank Doug, Len, and Kim especially because when you're an owner and a president, and this is the topic.
That was brave.
This is a tough hour.
That's what we need, right? We need to have these difficult discussions.
Good.
And we appreciate it. We have one more order of business before we leave tonight, in addition to thanking the panel, and that is to announce our next panel, which will be December 8th, also virtual, and we'll be looking back at the 2020 World Series with an all Terps panel including Tim Kirkchin of ESPN and two former Terps players who played in the World Series, Adam Kolarek of the Dodgers and Brandon Lau of the Rays. So very hopeful that people will register for that one. And I believe that the registration link is going to be in the chat box. So you'll be able to register tonight if you'd like to do that. But we're looking forward to seeing you for a great panel on the World Series on December 8th.
So, thank you very much, Mark. This is your baptism of the symposium. We'll see what happens next year.
Great. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.